His knee right in the middle all amongst us. So at the end of prayer, we'll grab him for it. So we'll carry him and bring him back. I thank you for this opportunity to speak to you this morning. It's always an honor to be here. And I wanted to thank those of you who've been praying for my father. Especially thank you for that. He's a tough old dude, and the doctor now is saying, well, he could have another 6 months. So that's been encouraging. Prayers also for my mother, who, as many of you have experienced, needs to be nursing him, and that can be difficult. Last week, Jerry began by asking about our relationship to sausage. You may remember he asked, did we like it? Do we dislike it? Were we conflicted about it? Do we have favorites? So today I'd like to start with another S word, stories. What do you think of when you think of stories? Perhaps you recall a favorite children's story, a story you grew up with, or maybe a story you read to your children time and time and time again. One of my friends who babysat our daughter a couple of evenings completely memorized at least 2 Dr. Seuss books in that story. Or perhaps you are thinking of a favorite novel, or maybe a favorite joke. A rabbi, a priest, and a pastor walk into a bar. The bartender looks up and says, what is this, a joke? Why do we tell stories? They can teach us moral lessons, or practical lessons, or tell us about the way the world is. Some of us believe that the kinds of stories we read to our children make a difference to the kind of character that they become. Stories entertain us, and many people believe that stories tell us who someone is. In fact, think about this. When someone asks, who is he or who is she? Can you answer that question without telling a story about that person? Think about when people meet. Once they've gotten past the part about talking about the weather, they almost inevitably start telling stories. That is also why some of us think that our lives can only be displayed in stories, that there is no other way to say who we are, what we believe, what we are doing. Some of you may remember the movie Out of Africa, or perhaps you've read the book. The author, Isak Dinesen, whose actual name was Karen Blixen, said this: all sorrows can be born if you can put them into a story or tell a story about them. Here's another part to telling stories. Psychologists, political scientists, and other social scientists all know that it is a fact about human psychology that we all want to be part of something that is bigger than ourselves. Telling stories about ourselves as part of something bigger than ourselves is a fundamental activity of human beings. And we have examples of this from Scripture. Ecclesiastes 3:11, one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, says this: he has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that human beings will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So in response to that eternity in our hearts, we tell stories to make sense of that eternity and to make it meaningful and understandable. Think about the sermons in the 5th book of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, especially the sermons in the early church when the church is still made up mostly of Jews. Recall how many of those sermons begin with the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the exodus out of Egypt under Moses and Aaron, then the occupation of the Promised Land, then the stories of David, then of the prophets, then of Jesus. One of the lessons of those sermons is that the story of Jesus cannot be understood apart from a much larger story. The hearers of those sermons understand themselves to be a part of that larger story, and so the apostles and the other early Christian missionaries would tell that big story in order to make sense of the story of Jesus. And you heard another version of that this morning in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 12, verse 5 or 6. Even some of Jesus' parables work that way, as part of a bigger story. And one of the features that makes Paul's sermon in Athens in the Areopagus stand apart from all of the other sermons in Acts is that he is talking to a Greek audience, so he does not begin with that bigger story, because they won't get it. Later on, though, they would learn that bigger story as part of their own story. It's probably worth pointing out at this point that some stories about bigger are not as good as others. a fascist story of America, which seems to be attractive to many Christians these days, is not as good or worthy a story as the story of the people of God. So what is our story? The author of the book of Hebrews devotes over 1,200 words to the story of faith. Why? At least two reasons. First, he begins with a very abstract notion, faith, and he offers this definition, actually at the end of the story. He says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of things not seen. Then he shows, by reference to a whole series of stories that would have been familiar to his audience, what that means. He tells stories of faith. And second, he wants to encourage his readers who are undergoing persecution. And he concludes with this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, we must get rid of every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and run with endurance the race set out for us, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Most Christian groups and denominations have a martyrology, a history or story of their martyrs. Mennonites are among them, and their martyrology is justly famous. So how many of you are familiar with Thielen van Bach's Martyr's Mirror? Hands up. Surely most of you know this. Okay. I brought it up on my bike this morning, and it's actually big enough that you notice the balance a little bit when you're turning around corners. As many of you know, it is not only a book about the Anabaptist and Mennonite martyrs. The full title of the book is Martyr's Mirror, the story of 15 centuries of Christian martyrdom from the time of Christ to AD 1660. The standard English translation, which I'm holding here now in my left hand, is about 1,150 pages long, and as you all know, it is in 2 columns, sort of like in an encyclopedia, so it has a lot of words. The first 60 pages in this translation is an introduction that summarizes the book and discusses certain basic Anabaptist doctrines. Pages 61 to 352 is a history of Christian martyrs from the time of Jesus and the apostles to the end of what we now call the Middle Ages, or the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Van Bach does not begin his story of the Anabaptist martyrs until page 353 of the English translation. In other words, nearly 1/3 of the way through the book. Van Bach understands the story of the Anabaptist martyrs to be part of a much larger and longer story of Christians witnessing to their faith up to and including death itself. Martyr's Mirror, as I've said, is a very large book with lots and lots of stories of faith and persecution. There are records of correspondence between people, records of laws and legal proceedings, copies of decrees and laws against Anabaptism, and all sorts of other written materials. The stated purpose of the book is to record the sufferings of the saints, that they may be an example and an encouragement to us. And I have several page references if you care. So, the purpose of Van Bach's book is the same as that of the author of the letter to the Hebrews. Because the book is so rich in material, in historical materials, scholars can read it for all sorts of reasons that actually have very little to do with that stated purpose. One scholar, for example, has traced changes in Anabaptist doctrines and beliefs over the course of the 150 years of Anabaptist history that the book covers. I've written on the way the book illustrates the possibility that husbands and wives can be friends, which is a much disputed idea among philosophers, feminists, and others. That question is also of some interest to Mennonite scholars because the early Anabaptist tradition was carried forward by many strong, independent women, but later Anabaptists became at times extremely patriarchal and nearly chauvinistic in their outlook and practices. I have traced 32 separate sets of correspondence between husbands and wives in the Martyr's Mirror, and had a lot of, I won't say fun, but it's been very interesting reading through those and making some sense of what was going on. There's also the artwork of Martyr's Mirror. The 1685 edition of the book is illustrated with 104 copper etchings by Jan Luyken, one of which was actually shown on the background of the screen last week, if you remember that background artwork. And there are about 25 or 26, 27 of those copper etchings still in existence, and they are all now housed in Bethel College in North Newton, Kansas. So the Martyr's Mirror is a history of the Anabaptist martyrs set into the context of a history of Christian martyrs more generally. When Dr. Harold Bender, whom Jerry mentioned last week, a Mennonite scholar, gave the presidential address of the American Society of Church History in December 1943, he called his address the Anabaptist Vision. In that address, he tried to tell the story of the Anabaptists as one clear, coherent line of intention and meaning. In his thinking, this clear, coherent line of what Anabaptism was about from the beginning would also make sense of Anabaptist martyrdom, what we're reading here in Martyr's Mirror. And Dr. Bender made the argument that in their vision of a pure, disciplined, apostolic community, the Anabaptists were trying to bring into being what the Protestant Reformation of Zwingli, Luther, and others had begun, but what it was unable to complete and fulfill. And Dr. Bender offers some solid evidence for his claims. And he does help us to make sense of Anabaptist martyrdom. Why were these people so willing to go to, in some cases, pretty gruesome deaths? He helps us to make sense of why the Anabaptists were willing to die for their faith, and also why so many people in authority were so keen to kill the Anabaptists for that faith. Dr. Bender went on in his address to argue that there were three broad principles or points of emphasis by which we could understand the Anabaptist movement of early 15th century all the way to his present day, 1943. Let me go through these very quickly just for a minute. The first principle, or the first part of the Anabaptist vision, the first emphasis, was the essence of Christianity as discipleship. This was not only an ideal. There is plenty of evidence that the early Anabaptists, in Dr. Bender's words, not only proclaimed the ideal of full Christian discipleship, but achieved in the eyes of their contemporaries and even their opponents a measurably higher level of performance than the average. There is plenty of evidence in the historical records for this claim. And it appears that Anabaptist moral and community purity and the achievement of Christian ideals was one of the qualities that made Anabaptists in the 16th and 17th century attractive to many people. If we read the letters and other documents in the Martyr's Mirror, that claim becomes very clear. You see it throughout the correspondence that I've studied between husbands and wives. Second principle, there was a new conception of the church as a brotherhood. And this conception was in stark contrast to the state-sponsored churches, especially of the Protestant Reformation, and in contrast to the church as merely an institution of society, and it enforced the idea of the Christian moral, economic, and social performance that the Anabaptists stressed should be the essence of Christian discipleship. And the third part of the vision was a new ethic of love and non-resistance. Now, there are two big problems with Dr. Bender's account of the Anabaptist vision. The first is that it is only partially true. And the second, and this is not a criticism, is that it isn't pastoral. It doesn't tell us enough about what we should be doing today in 2016 in Kelowna. On the first, the story of Anabaptist beginnings is much messier and much more complicated than Dr. Bender's story of the Anabaptist vision would allow. And you cannot simply disown every Anabaptist who does not entirely agree with your story of a particular vision or who behaves badly, sometimes behaves very badly. You can still try to find lines of meaning, you can still tell stories, but you have to recognize that the story of God's work with His people is often much more complicated, messy, and uncontrolled than the single-minded pursuit of a specific idea. Seeking the face of God is not the same as following an idea. Seeking the face of God is not the same as following an idea. If we want to tell the full Anabaptist story, we will have to own the Anabaptist rebellion at Münster in 1535 and in Amsterdam. And we will have to own other stories of bad Anabaptist behavior right up until the present day. We'll have to own the patriarchalism of some Mennonite communities. We will have to own the exchange of faith for tradition will have to own the abandonment of a missionary ideal at times. On the second question of what we should be and do today in 2016 Kelowna, most of the critics of Harold Bender got the story wrong as well. There were a number of alternatives to Harold Bender's vision, of Anabaptist vision. And I won't go into the details here. But there is a pastoral concern for all of us in thinking about this story of the Anabaptist martyrs and what it means for us. And that is, what lessons should we draw from the stories of the martyrs? What lessons should we draw for our personal lives and for our life together in community? We may not be called to give up our very lives for the faith, but what are we called to give up? What does it mean to be faithful in 2016 in Kelowna? Even if we fully and completely agreed with Professor Bender's understanding of Anabaptist history and the Anabaptist vision, what would that mean for how we are faithful church today in this place? Can we separate our traditions, our cultural comforts, from the meaning of that vision? Many Mennonites, as you all know, are fast becoming indistinguishable from contemporary evangelical Christians. Is that a good thing? Maybe, maybe not. And there are other things we could say about that. When the author of the letter to the Hebrews reminds us of the martyrs, because he wants to encourage us to keep steadfast, what should that story mean for us? When the author of Martyr's Mirror does the same thing, what should those stories mean for us? What do they say about our witness to the watching world in 2016?